All right, so before we get to the political nonsense, let's talk about something really important, Ancient Apocalypse, the Netflix show. Why do I want to talk about Ancient Apocalypse? Because, not so much because of the content, because it is a perfect representation of the information crisis, which I believe is the most important thing happening. It may not be the most important thing happening in the moment, but I think it's the big picture of what's happening. So this is by a guy named Graham Hancock. He identifies as an investigative journalist. They keep calling him a pseudo-archaeologist, but that's not fair. He's not. And he has a theory about the world. Let's take just a quick look at the trailer. It's cut 6.
I don't think we're seeing the origins of civilization at the end of the Ice Age. I think we're seeing a reboot of civilization that existed previously. Don't look for ourselves in the past. Look for something different from ourselves, but nevertheless was capable of doing things that archaeologists tell us nobody was capable of doing at that time. We need more questions, not less questions. We need more competing narratives, not less competing narratives. And that's why I'm very disappointed in archaeology, in the way it's reacted to this, and in journalism, in the way that it's just taken on board what the archaeologists say without asking any questions at all. It's like a black hole. You almost recognize it by its absence. There's something missing in the past, and there's loads of anomalies that come down to it that can only be explained by a forgotten episode in the human story. So I've made it my business to be an advocate of that position.
So his theory is basically that before the last ice age, about 12,000 years ago, about 10,000 years before Christ, it was called the Younger Dryas, because when all the ice melted, it was hard to find a place where you could keep your ass dry. I just made that part up. But anyway, his theory is that before the Ice Age, there was an advanced civilization, kind of like the legends of Atlantis, the sunken city, and that after the Ice Age came the floods, which are celebrated in legends and in the Bible and all this. But some of the people from this hyper-civilized society remained, and they traveled the world teaching people how to build and how to do certain things. And that's why you find very sophisticated buildings that seem to date back, or possibly could date back to the Ice Age, even though most people think there were not highly civilized societies before that. And the sites, I have to say, I watched the entire thing. It was very gripping. The sites he visits are, his basic idea is that all these hunter-gatherers, these primitive people were there, and then these guys from Atlantis or whatever came and taught them all these different skills. So the sites he visits are incredibly interesting, the actual famous real sites. Some of them just actually interesting to hear him describe them. He raises some interesting questions, like why are there so many myths about people bringing culture to a civilization? The myth of Prometheus. Why does Prometheus have to bring fire? You would think that would be an easy thing for man to discover. Just watch lightning set a tree on fire and realize it's more fun to cook your meat and eat it after you put it over the fire. That seems like an easy discovery. Why does Prometheus bring it? I've always wondered how they figured out to turn wheat into bread. That seems like a much more difficult discovery. But even in Black Panther, the movie, remember the culture comes from the sky. It comes out of. It's not people inventing culture. It's culture being given to them. But other things are a lot less convincing. He talks about the repeated use of pyramids and the fact that pyramids are often tombs, and he says that they all have the same idea. But a pyramid is an easy thing to build, and the human mind is not that varied. People think of the same things all the time. Happens in Hollywood all the time. They come up with the same movies in different places. The whole thing kind of reminded me when I was a kid. There was a book called Chariot of the Gods. It made a very big splash, claiming that the pyramids were built by aliens, that their aliens had come and given civilization. It was silly stuff, but people enjoyed it, and it speaks to something. But the point is not for me whether what Hancock says is true or not. My point is how we deal with what he's doing. Let's talk about Hancock first. The first thing is he doesn't allow in any counter evidence into his story, and that's very important psychologically. This is why I didn't cover the January 6 hearings, because they didn't cross-examine. And even a good journalist, this is perfectly natural, this is the human nature, they will start to say, well, there's no cross-examination, but here's an interesting fact. No, if there's no cross-examination, there are no interesting facts. You have to hear both sides. And if you don't think that's true, think about how easily you are fooled by absurd conspiracy theories until you hear the other side. The absurd, and it is an absurd conspiracy theory, that the moon landing was faked. It's a conspiracy that doesn't even make any sense. But, you listen to people and you think like, yeah, that's true. And then you hear the real story. You only have to look on Popular Mechanics, and they'll tell you the real story. They say, why did the flag wave? Well, it was kind of an aluminum flag it wasn't waving. It was all this, it was just really silly stuff. But if you don't hear the other side, it's very convincing. The 9/11 attackers, that's one of my favorites. I mean, my favorite thing, Muslim radicals tried to blow up the World Trade Center. They failed. They said we'd come back. They came back. They blew it up. They said they blew it up. And people went, who was it really? It was the Muslim radicals. They told you they were going to do it. And we had them there. And there's one moment when a BBC reporter reports that one of the buildings has fallen down about 20 minutes before it actually falls down. So and people say, see, she knew it was going to happen. And I think, well, what is that theory that George W. Bush plotted to murder 3,000 Americans so he could get the Patriot Act passed, but first he briefed the BBC? That's how they knew. Don't tell anybody, BBC, but we're going to kill 3,000 Americans. BBC, okay, well, we'll wait until, and then, oops, we slipped. We got it 20 minutes early. I've covered breaking news stories, the panic and the chaos and all this stuff. People say a lot of things. This just turned out to happen to become true later on. So absolute nonsense. But it's very believable if you don't hear the other side of the story. Just the other day, Tucker Carlson put out this thing about the CIA involvement in JFK's assassination. Now, I don't happen to believe that, but he has a right to make that claim. But it's not that he made the claim. It was suddenly people were saying, why isn't everybody covering this? And I thought, because I watched the segment. He didn't have it. He didn't have proof that it was a speculation, which he's welcome to make. And I like Tucker. He does great journalism sometimes. But you're going to make a claim like that, you really need to do some journalism and get some proof. But people just instantly bought into it. So, Joe Rogan appears on this Graham Hancock show, and I thought to myself, I like Joe Rogan. I think he does terrific work, but I don't care what he thinks about this guy's theory. Why should I care? Why should you care what I think about his theory? You got to talk to archaeologists. But this brings me up to the other side of this. If anything gives Graham Hancock's amazingly weird theory any kind of credibility, it was the way that archaeologists reacted. Now, to be fair, Hancock rips into archaeologists the whole thing, and a lot of it was unfair. It was all about how, they dismiss him and they're condescending and they're, small-minded. But archaeology is really hard, and you've got this there's a famous story called the Motel of the Mysteries, where they uncover a motel and, of course, make all the wrong judgments about what everything is. It's hard to do archaeology. You're getting very little stuff. So you find a picture of a woman, they say, well, it was a fertility goddess, but maybe it was a piece of porn. You don't know what it was. It's really hard. It's all speculation. So he's very tough on them. So their responses, just really, really interesting. The Society of American Archaeology wrote a letter to Netflix urging the platform to reclassify the show as science fiction rather than documentary, arguing it publicly disparages archaeologists and devalues the archaeological profession. So what? Publicly disparaging archaeologists isn't a crime, and it isn't a reason for Netflix to care. Maybe he's right. He's putting forward an opinion. What you want to do is you want to debunk him. Have been stories in the past where the experts were wrong and an amateur was right. Schliemann, back in the 19th century, discovered Troy. And he was kind of a con man. He got things wrong, and he did it wrong. But he did find the city of Troy when other people were saying, no, it's just Homer, it was just poetry, it was just a myth. So these things do happen, and disparaging archaeologists, you have no right to respect. You don't have a right to respect. You earn respect. Now, if I'm an archaeologist, I don't write to Netflix to attack the film. I post videos debunking the film, and I might want to make a documentary debunking the film. And some people did do this. There were a lot of them. There weren't enough of them, but there were a lot of them. There's a site called Ancient Archaeology. Now, Hancock's most convincing episode is about a site in Turkey called Göbekli Tepe. And he says it appears out of nowhere, and there was no sign that they could build something so spectacular before this, so it must have been the guys from Atlantis came and taught them how to do it. And Ancient Archaeology posted this on YouTube debunking this, and this is how it's done. Cut 7.
In Ancient Apocalypse on Netflix, when talking about the 11,600-year-old site of Göbekli Tepe, Graham Hancock says,
You can't just wake up one morning with no prior skills, no prior knowledge, no background in working with stone and create something like Göbekli Tepe. There has to be a long history behind it, and that history is completely missing.
But in ancient Anatolia, there are a number of sites with origins older than Göbekli Tepe, going back to the Epi-Paleolithic, and this number is growing all the time. Çakmak Tepe in particular is now a growing site of interest because it shows a clear evolutionary step in human skills, architecture and art. None of these sites were mentioned in the show, but proved that these people lived through the Younger Dryas and did have A. prior skills, B. prior knowledge, and C. a clear background of working with stone.
That's how you do that. You show what the guy said, you show the answer to what he said. I happen to know that this video is absolutely right. There are these older sites. That's how you debunk somebody. You don't tell them, take the show off the air. Or, there was one guy, they wouldn't even let Hancock on their site to film because they didn't like his theories, and it makes them look like children, and it makes Hancock look like the big boy in the room. That's not how you do it, and it's so often how experts react. Now, I showed you a good version, but a lot of the reaction from archaeologists, from professors, and from professional debunkers, misinformation guys, was much different. And I'm taking this one guy out. His name is Farley, Bill Farley. He's an associate professor of archaeology, but I don't mean to pick on him. I'm just doing him because he represents a lot of the stuff that they got. Here is one of his attacks on Graham Hancock. This is cut 8.
I'm not going to knock the guy for writing books and selling books, whatever. But he's being elevated right now into this thing called the intellectual dark web. For those of you who aren't aware, this is the sort of loosely knit group of conservative thinkers like Ben Shapiro, Charlie Kirk, and in this case, most notably, Jordan Peterson. I think Graham Hancock is the Jordan Peterson of archaeology. Now, I have complex, nuanced feelings about Jordan Peterson. I'm not going to discuss that here in this video. Hancock is an interestingly similar figure, right? He doesn't always say heinous stuff. He's not constantly lying. Sometimes he says things that are nice, but he has this academic-like pedigree. He doesn't have a PhD and he's not a professor like Peterson, but he has this long pedigree of publication and decades in the public eye to lean on in a very similar way. That makes him potentially more impactful and dangerous, right?
So I like the way he explains the dark web. For those of you who are not familiar with it, the dark web is where they teach terrorists how to make bombs. It's not Ben Shapiro explaining the Constitution and Jordan telling you to make your bed and get married and talking to experts about the Bible. That is not the dark web. I'm sorry, we have a lot of good qualities, but one of them is not being the dark web here at the DailyWire. And he has Joe Rogan up there. It's just people he disagrees with. And the fact that Graham Hancock, there's nothing political in this. There's not one political thing in this. But this is the other thing he says. And I'm not picking on this particular guy, but this is representative of a lot of things that people were saying and given credence in the press for saying it. Here's cut 9.
I don't know if Graham Hancock is a racist. I don't know if Graham Hancock is a white supremacist. He may or may not be. But what he does not do in this show is address a long and deep history of white supremacy that is associated with his ideas. So Hancock's ideas, some of them are his own, some of them are borrowed from previous scholars going back to the 19th century and earlier, and all of them are utilized and associated with white supremacy movements. They are used to undercut indigenous claims to landscapes. They're used to undercut the achievements of indigenous people and ancient peoples of all types around the world. They are problematic and they are used to launder ideas by white supremacists and white supremacist groups. So my question to Hancock is this. You knew that was going to be a criticism of this show. You understood that going into it. I know you knew that. So why don't you address it?
So, I don't know that this guy is a pedophile. He may or may not be a pedophile Nazi communist. He may or may not be. But, he knew I was going to say it about him, so why didn't he address it? It's an absurd thing to say. What he's referring to is the thesis that these indigenous people didn't have skills, so therefore they must have been given to them by somebody greater than they are. But Hancock makes absolutely no claims about the racial quality of these people. I think he believes they come from Turkey, really. And he also is very respectful toward indigenous people. He talks about their skills and all this. It's just crap. And the thing is, violating leftist orthodoxy doesn't make the thing you say untrue. Even if Hancock, and he's not, but even if he were a racist or a white supremacist, the words coming out of his mouth might be the facts, right? He might be he's talking about archaeology. The archaeology might be the facts. This thing about calling people racist, calling people white supremacists is a failure of the expert class. And that's what they keep arguing about. There's another lawyer, Timothy Caulfield, and they call him a debunker of misinformation. And he says, Ancient Apocalypse is just one example of a wider cultural trend denying expertise and the value of science. It almost makes denying expertise sound like a noble task. Well, you know, if the experts stop calling people racist, if they stop lying about Hunter Biden's laptop, or whether the vaccines were properly tested to see if they would stop the spread of disease, or whether they do stop the spread of disease, or whether the disease came from China or not, if they would stop lying to us, if they would stop trying to control us instead of informing us, maybe debunking experts wouldn't look like such a fun thing to do, like such a noble thing to do. This is the information crisis. It's people fighting for their power position, for their status positions, rather than doing the job that makes those positions worthwhile. You're not an expert if you lie. If you're you're just a liar if you lie. You might have expertise, but the minute you start lying, you're no longer an expert. You're just a liar. Fauci lied. The government has lied. The left has lied about amazing millions of things. Our president lies. We wouldn't be debunking them if it weren't possible to do it. Twitter lied at the behest of the FBI. So all of this stuff is part of this crisis that we're in. And this Ancient Apocalypse, it's a silly show. I'm not going to tell you it's true. That's the whole problem. The conspiracy theories sound true because the people debunking them have lost our respect, and they deserve to have lost our respect. For more Klavan-y goodness, like and subscribe, and also subscribe to The Andrew Klavan Show. It's on Apple Podcasts, it's on Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts. Give us a 5-star review. It really helps, and we appreciate it.